I'm going to try to keep this as friendly to the layperson as possible, so that everybody could sort of understand this. And I want to start off on that note. The sort of general kind of format in which mainstream economists tend to speak today is, it's very inaccessible to the ordinary person. They use all these kind of terminologies, these kinds of, they'll say that, oh my God, this randomized control trial that I did, suggests these XYZ findings, this econometrics model, and so on and so forth, right? It's very sort of disconnected from the ordinary person. The ordinary people can't really understand what most economists are talking about, particularly from the sort of neoclassical tradition, right? Pakistan today finds itself on the brink of sort of sovereign default, of economic collapse. It's quite a sort of situation on our hands here, and and the political elite of Pakistan, they're not exactly sort of bothered by this situation. They are sort of, still sort of engaged in this turf war with each other, sort of just trying to signal their suitability to the security apparatus, and obviously that is fundamentally why we are in this situation. It's because our ruling elites aren't exactly accountable to the ordinary citizen when it comes to sort of power relations and so on. They are sort of more accountable to 4 or 5 power centers, right, which include sort of big landlords, industrialists, the security apparatus, of course, and the sort of international financial institutions, donor agencies that function in Pakistan and across the world as well. And so that is fundamentally why they have never really had the incentive to prioritize service delivery for the ordinary citizen, right? And it's worth understanding this. For those of you who are familiar with me, you know that I'm like a sort of big fan of Karl Marx, and there's this famous quote where he said that the philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it, right? However, in Pakistan, I feel like we haven't really even understood why we are in this situation, right? So I'm going to try to shed light on what the factors were that led us to this point in the first place. This conversation is going to be structured in 3 parts. The first one is going to be a brief history of Pakistan's political economy. The second one is going to be a bit of an exploration of neoliberalism as an ideology and the impact that it has had on the discipline of economics as a whole, right? And finally, one of the sort of criticisms that we get as progressives is that we never really propose solutions. We are always talking about things that are going wrong. And so I'm going to try to shed light on how we can sort of take an exit from this kind of quagmire that we find ourselves in. So without further ado, and before beginning, I'd like to encourage all of you to sort of chime in whenever you want. It's an open floor, so if you have any questions, any concerns, if you want to challenge me, if you want to call me an idiot, please feel free to do that whenever you'd like. All right, so I think a good place to begin would be to sort of talk a little bit about our identity as a country. And Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy has written a great book on this very recently, came out last month. Our identity during independence, in the lead up to independence and so on, we never really had a sort of identity of our own, an organic identity that feels true to most people, most ordinary people in Pakistan. We have always sort of defined ourselves as whatever India is, we had a minus sign in front of that, and we are the opposite of that, right? We never had really an identity of our own, right? And so the function that really served for our history, for our trajectory, was that we could never really move beyond a kind of like domineering role from the security apparatus, right? Because if you're always going to create an identity that is based on perpetual threat from across the eastern border, naturally you need a strong security apparatus that is, intervening in our political affairs constantly, right? And so that is primarily fundamentally why we have never been able to promote genuine organic democratization in Pakistan, where ruling elites are actually sort of responsive to the concerns of the citizenry. And this is a very important point, because if you look at our history, we have had 3 military coups, we've had almost 30 years of formal rule, and about 75 years of informal rule from the security apparatus, right? For instance, right, if you look at the sort of late 50s and into the 60s, some of the General Ayub Khan's rule, right? When India was pursuing things like land reform, when they were prioritizing their industries, when they were working on their education sector, when they were promoting, incubating civil society, and so on. What were we doing? We were involved in what is known as the sort of Green Revolution, right? What was the Green Revolution? The context of this is obviously very important. This was around about when the CETO and CENTO agreements were being made. CETO is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. CENTO is the Central Treaty Organization, right? Also known as the Baghdad Pact. And these were both security agreements to sort of try to curtail the spread, the influence of communism at that time during the Cold War, right? And for that reason, we got involved with the United States at that time, in exchange for which we received tremendous military and economic assistance, right? And so that is essentially what sort of fueled the Green Revolution. The Ford Foundation in particular was the organization that was sort of funding us at that time, funneling in resources into the agricultural sector of Pakistan. And we experienced quite a lot of, at least on paper, GDP growth, economic growth. It is commonly, even to this day, referred to by mainstream economists as, the decade of development and so on and so forth, right? But if you look into the details, obviously it's more complicated than that. The Green Revolution, which was kind of like an initiative to, increase access to tractors, install irrigation systems, fertilizers, and so on and so forth, right? But the primary beneficiaries of this was always sort of like big landlords, right? Who really didn't need that kind of assistance, right? And so what this functioned to do was that it increased their sort of power in their respective communities, which triggered a large-scale sort of urbanization. Urbanization, I say, in quotation marks, because what mainstream economists will say about this today is that this was primarily like, these people are moving to cities in search of better economic opportunities and so on and so forth. They say it as if it was like a sort of a good thing, but really why they were doing it was because of the sort of increased economic precarity that they faced, because of this sort of, enhanced kind of power by the landlords in that situation at that time, right? And so when they sort of migrated into the cities, and this is the sort of main cities of Karachi, Lahore, Peshawar, and so on, they didn't really have quite a good time in cities. They faced even more sort of economic precarity. Cities were always very hostile to them, especially if they were sort of involved in the informal market. Agar kisi ne koi paan ka khoka lagaya hua hai, ya if they're pushing a streetcar and so on and so forth. They always sort of experienced a lot of economic precarity in that situation, and they do to this day. And why is that? It's because our cities are always sort of hostile to the poor. We sort of approach urbanization almost in a kind of suspicious way where, we're not open to the poor. We think the poor are dirty, filthy people who should be kept isolated, excluded. We want to, hide away in our sort of private housing schemes and so on. Obviously, military bureaucracies are very much involved in this process. Private contractors are very much involved. Economic elites are obviously very much involved. And they all sort of work in close collaboration with each other to ensure that cities remain insulated from the poor, right? And this is also what explains the kind of anti-encroachment drives that we see all the time and so on. Right, so that's the Green Revolution story, right? Following that, we had Zulfikar Bhutto come in the 70s, and this is a bit of a controversial kind of figure. You can have your opinions about him. He did some things right, some things wrong, but in our economic history, he is the only leader who tried to pursue institutional reform in its true sense, right? Who actually tried to incubate our industries, who tried to pursue things like healthcare access for all, who tried to eliminate poverty and so on and so forth. He was the only one who actually sort of, made an effort, right? Even with land reform and so on. And so some of them were unsuccessful, some of them were more successful and so on. We can debate about this, but I'd like to read some stats about it because I feel like there's a lot of propaganda about it as well. This sort of common sort of narrative is that, Bhutto killed our industries. Bhutto completely, he crowded out the private sector and things of that sort, right? But if you look into the details here, I'd like to read some of these out for you. The sales of all nationalized industries increased from 1,400 million rupees in 72 to 2,400 million in 73, which is an increase of 64%, right? At a constant price of, at the 69, 70 years, the economy saw the relative share of total public sector investment sharply increase from 12.6% in 72 to 60.2% in 74 and 75. Exports increased by 153% over the previous year, and manufactured exports grew by 19% in 73, 74. These are all these are unprecedented, Which other political leader has actually achieved something like this in Pakistan's history? Who has even had the political will to do something like this? Nobody. It was only Bhutto, and they got rid of him in the late 70s, as they do with a lot of our sort of leaders who try to sort of, deviate a little bit from, the security apparatus' general sort of, preferences. Any questions? Any sort of input from anyone on so far? Yeah.
What will you say about those land reforms Zulfikar Ali Bhutto passed, which basically cut off certain sizes? Some of the landlords, what they have done was they just distributed amongst the relatives and all that. So, what do you see about this land reform?
Yeah, 100%. I think you're totally correct in saying that the sort of general structure that initiative followed, and we saw it previously with Ayub Khan as well. Ceilings, land ceilings, right? So most landlords, particularly the big ones who were falling above the ceiling, what they did was that they just sort of distributed it among friends and family members, and so the structure of power remained the same, but the land titles were changed. So that didn't really affect anything in a sort of substantial way. But I think about 5 million acres of land is a statistic that actually was able to be redistributed. So it's definitely something, right? It's not nothing, but it's not going to make that much of a difference, right? So I think in the future, if we do sort of consider land reform again, which I think we should, hopefully soon, we should try to adopt a slightly different sort of approach. We can learn from other countries like Japan, Taiwan, China, and so on. China is a bit of a violent story. I hope we don't get to that point, but maybe Japan would be better. Anyone else?
So in the start, you've said that we have had a identity crisis, right?
Yep.
So we've also had a political identity crisis as well. You're saying that we started from Cedo and Cento, and that's like moving away from communism. But what Bhutto did was go back to communism. Yeah. So at this point, if I'm someone that's thinking about this and what is our political direction then? If you're saying the stats, okay, the stats back up everything. There's a 60%, 70% increase in everything, but there is no political contiguity or fluidness within the political system here. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'd like to come to this at the end of the discussion because I will sort of propose how we can take a sort of exit strategy from everything that's been going on. I appreciate that question. Good question.
In today's economic situation, we always believe that privatization is probably the better solution as compared to the nationalization of the private institutions. I mean, we have many examples like railway or PIE who has become the burden for us. It's very interesting to know. I mean, that Bhutto has done the other way around. How did he make sure that the system remains functional and the people don't take their sarkari nokri, no offense to sarkari officials, their job seriously and really try to deliver what is expected in terms of profitability, in terms of giving better service, in terms of exports?
Sure.
Just want you to shed some light on this.
Good question. I think I'll answer this one. First of all, I think it's important to understand that state-owned enterprises, their function is not to generate profits. Right? State-owned enterprises, their function is to deliver services to the people, even if they are making a loss. I think we also should try to challenge this notion that whatever falls under the domain of the government will, by default, be badly run. Because we have several examples from across the world where this is not the case. If you look at most countries in Scandinavia, Europe, UK's healthcare system, it's all very much state-controlled, and they're all very resilient and dynamic systems, right? So I think a lot of this comes from a sort of Cold War political propaganda that was sort of sold to us to maybe like push the idea that it's all about the private sector. If you look at the Soviet Union after its dismantling in 1991, there was a survey that was done about like 4 years later, where ordinary people were sort of surveyed and asked, what changed? Do you feel like there's been any improvements in your lifestyle and so on? Largely across the board, 80 to 85% of people said that, it was much better under the Soviet system, right? Were they all lying? Probably not, right? So I think a lot of this is also like, the media and the kind of propaganda that is sold to people and so on, just to sort of push the private sector everywhere. The private sector, one of its like fundamental issues is that it will always, have its primary incentive to generate revenues and profits, right? And that will never sort of, particularly when it comes to things like healthcare, they will never have a sort of incentive to give you a sustainable solution to your problem. Their incentive is to sort of, keep you engaged, turn you into a repeat customer, engage you for the long run, sell more and more drugs to you, more and more consultations, prescriptions, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, important to understand. It's worth sort of acknowledging that there are certain domains where the private sector can never really sort of be successful over the long haul, and we see this across the world. There's a reason why the most developed countries in the world today, all of their sort of education, healthcare, even housing. Singapore is a great country to, cite here as a case study. 85% of housing in Singapore is provided by the government. This is like one of the sort of East Asian tigers. They're generally stated as a famous success story. How many of you knew that, by the way? Just out of curiosity. Just one person in the room, right? So, a lot of this information is kind of like hidden away. You have to sort of really dig to find it, right? But these are all real numbers, right? So, that's my sort of brief answer to you. We'll keep moving, and hopefully we can have more and more questions. Tika? One of the things about Zia ul-Haq's period was also that it was the start of our structural adjustment programs from the IMF, right? Now, this is what is generally known as the neoliberal turn, which is what this talk is all about. Neoliberalism, if I had to define it briefly, it constitutes three primary facets, right? Privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization. And the IMF and more generally international financial institutions, their approach is always to sort of push these three objectives regardless of the context. So whether they're operating in Latin America or South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, their prescriptions are always the same, right? They will sort of approach regions as blank slates to impose theories upon, and that is primarily why you don't see any sort of success stories from any of these regions, right? Wherever the IMF has come in with their sort of structural adjustment programs, the situation has always gotten worse. But will the IMF ever take responsibility for this or accountability for this? When their programs fail, they kind of, engage in all sorts of mental gymnastics to try to, scurry away from the situation. They'll sort of say things like, "Oh, our prescriptions weren't really implemented. These ruling elites here that were working with us, they weren't really cooperating with us. Then why did you give us the loan? Your loans are all condition-based. They will only release these funds when they know that these, policy prescriptions are being acted upon, right? So when they say that they weren't being acted upon, ideally they shouldn't have, released their funds, right? All of this is very important, right? We'll come back to neoliberalism, neoclassical economic theory, and so on. It's more of like a detailed conversation. I want to keep moving with the history of Pakistan's political economy. Fast forward to the 2000s, after 9/11. This is, again, this is a sort of recurring pattern that most of you are probably picking up on. The rentier economy model. Pakistan's ruling elites have always approached governance from the perspective of sort of selling our geostrategic location to attract funds from their global economy, right? That is the primary sort of like objective and strategy, right? So right after 9/11, we were involved in the war on terror, This was Pervez Musharraf's enlightened moderation period, And again, you ask mainstream economists about that period today, they'll talk about it as if it was a very good period. It was very good for the ruling elites, perhaps. What about everybody else, right? And so, Pervez Musharraf's period was one that was quite catastrophic in terms, and obviously this was a build-up from Ziaul Haq's sort of involvement in the Afghanistan conflict, where we sort of, operated as an incubation center for the Mujahideen forces, also known as freedom fighters, in the Pentagon, right? Freedom fighters. There's a great quote from comedian George Carlin, who said that if firefighters fight fire and crime fighters fight crime, then what do freedom fighters fight? Nobody talks about that, right? And so, again, very important. And the consequences of that were catastrophic for Pakistan. If you look at the kind of generally hyper-conservative, extremist sort of religious sort of culture in Pakistan today, it all boils down to that, really. When you are sort of behaving as a hired gun for imperial forces, particularly the U.S., you're just going to go along with whatever they're saying. Our sort of intelligence apparatus functioned during that period to, incubate the Mujahideen, to popularize this kind of extreme ideology of Islam, almost redefining Islam to sort of just suit the geopolitical interests of that time. The kind of drug culture that was enabled by that, the kind of Kalashnikov culture that was enabled because of that, kind of entire economy of drugs, enabled purely because of that, right? The results were what? What did we achieve by doing all of that? Nothing really, right? We only had downsides, we didn't have any upside, right? And so, again, with Musharraf's period, clampdowns everywhere on civil society, on the media, on, students, on labor unions, and so on and so forth. West of them, the labor unions were sort of, formally banned during the Ziaul Haq period, And so all of those things are very important, right? And then obviously, 2008, we had the Charter of Democracy, where PPP and PMLN finally sat down. They drafted the charter. They came up with some points about, an independent judiciary, minimal interference from the security apparatus, devolution of power, and so on and so forth, right? We haven't seen any sort of explicit military intervention since then. That was also around the period when the 18th Amendment came in. But if you actually look at the Charter of Democracy, and you go through each of the points, hardly any of them have been implemented in true sort of spirit. It's all just sort of on paper, right? So 2008 onwards, we might have had a sort of, quote unquote civilian government, but who was really running policy in Pakistan? It was mostly sort of multilateral donor agencies. The IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, USAID, various donor agencies in Europe, And that is primarily why we haven't really sort of seen any kind of sustainable, inclusive economic growth or development in Pakistan to this day. Today we find ourselves, with the twin deficits crisis, the fiscal and current account. We have, rampant stagflation, which is a combination of inflation and unemployment. People are really sort of having a difficult time here. And so all of this is, it's all sort of linked, right? In our sort of political history, our ruling elites have never really approached governance with the assurance, let's say, that if they were able to perform, if they were able to demonstrate results, then they would have a chance of coming back into power for subsequent terms. And the reason for that is that they've never been accountable directly to the ordinary citizen, but they've been accountable to 4 or 5 power centers, like I said, industrialists, landlords, security apparatus, and so on and so forth. So when they are in the power corridors, they're just sort of signaling their suitability, their usefulness to the security apparatus or these other power centers, instead of trying to demonstrate results, trying to pursue institutional reform, trying to increase levels of education or healthcare, trying to eliminate poverty. These are all important objectives that most governments around the world, where ruling elites are actually accountable to the people, will try to pursue. But over here, it's never been the case, right? I'll pause here. Any questions?
Sir, as you said, our nationalization policy have deteriorated our system in the era of Bhutto.
Oh, I didn't say that. That's what most people will say. Yeah.
Sir, don't you think in a country like Pakistan, where leaders are in a continuous tussle with each other and bureaucracies have made a pet government, pet structure like, and public is involved in their polarization, is there any possibility that privatization can solve our problems of economy in the long run?
Okay, good question. Anyone else? So I'll talk about privatization in this next part, right? We'll talk very detailed sort of way about privatization. So I'll address those questions then.
Assalamu alaikum. The question is that if we look at it from 1947 to 1960, we have seen there was not a perfect economic model for Pakistan from 1947 to from the 1960. Then we look at it from 1960. The Howard trickle-down model was started from the 1960.
Which model?
Howard trickle-down. Howard trickle-down model
Yeah.
was started by the Ayub Khan from 1958 to up till 1969.
Yeah.
And then we have seen the socialist model has started which you have defended that how the export was increased in the Bhutto era and how you have,
I haven't defended
you have
that.
appreciated the Bhutto a lot, but I don't agree with you on that context. But I will explain how I know.
But I don't have an opinion on that. I just mentioned some statistics. Anyway.
You have, okay. And then you came to the Zia had done this and Zia Islamization model has started. That's economy was started.
Yeah.
Don't you see these all the model which we had pursued throughout the history? These were pursued. This one model were pursued by any country. Look at the Saudi Arabia. They are currently they are following the neoliberalism model because they are giving the freedom to their market and they're performing well. And but in context of Pakistan has the nationalized the PIS, MEs and different these are the public enterprises. Look at the PIA right now. PIA has the annual loss of the 55 billion, and we cannot defend the nationalization. If the privatization can do something for you, why not we move toward the privatization? And we need to follow the so-called nationalization. The nationalization cannot solve our problem. That's how neoliberalism can solve the problem. Right? Or look at it, the America. Look at it, those all these the developed nations. They are all following the neoliberalism and they are performing well. And what is the problem with us that we are defending the nationalization? If you look at it, just said the export was the sales export was increased in Bhutto era, but I don't think so. The export was, but you are comparing with his tenure from the 1971 to compare from his previous year, but you are not comparing with the era of Ayub. In the era of Ayub, I know there was they had played with the statistic at that time, but I want to add that. But there was some type of growth.
Understood.
But in nationalization of the Bhutto, it's proved the curse. We are still feeling the aftershocks of the nationalization right now.
I appreciate that.
Every institution is a cripple right now in Pakistan because of the policy of the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and we are still facing it, and we are still not able to do that and getting to get rid of that.
Understood.
Yes.
Thank you for that question. Appreciate that. Just like a follow-up question to you, when was the last time we had nationalization in Pakistan? How long has it been? Almost 50 years. Following the end of the Bhutto regime, we have not had nationalization. In fact, here's another statistic. We have privatized over 240 enterprises since that time. Now, this was largely in response to the sort of prescriptions we received from the IMF, right? Where they sort of pushed the neoliberal model, privatized things, and so on. And the justification that they offered to us at that time was that this is going to resolve your fiscal deficit crisis. Everybody familiar what fiscal deficit means, right? The difference between like government expenditures and government revenues, right? And we have been following that model for the past at least 46 years or so. Privatized over 240 enterprises. And we are on the brink of sovereign default. And so I think it's worth paying attention and taking that statistic seriously, right? Because if it was to work, it would have, 40, 50 years is a pretty long time, And so I think it's important to go into the details with these things, because there's this logical fallacy. It's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. I'll come back towards the end, right? The no true Scotsman fallacy is when you propose a set of prescriptions that are so idealistic so impossible to achieve that you always have the built-in excuse of a lack of implementation when it doesn't work out, right? And that is what most defenders of privatization and so on have been resorting to since that period, right? Where it's like, oh, you only implemented 60% of what we said. You should have implemented 100% of what we said. That's never really going to happen. What you're really doing is that you're shifting goalposts. You're redefining what it means to privatize. Either privatization works or it doesn't work. You can't have both, right? But this kind of mental gymnastics is seen from international financial institutions all the time, right? If we actually did 70, 80% of what they told us to do, we should have experienced some sort of improvement, right? But we didn't, right? And again, like the private sector's primary incentive to perform is the profit motive, the government's primary incentive to perform is democracy. If ruling elites know that if they are able to perform, they can come back into power for subsequent terms, they will take that seriously and they'll have an incentive to actually pursue effective service delivery for the people, right? But we didn't ever have that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, right? And like I said, across the world, let me mention this other statistic. Following the end of the Cold War, if you look at all the developed countries around the world, particularly the OECD countries, which are the most developed across the world, and if you look at the statistic known as government expenditure as a percentage of GDP from 1990, every single one of these countries has gone up. What does that suggest? What does government expenditure as a percent of GDP mean? It means the government's involvement in the economy. So the examples that you stated with developed countries have been following the neoliberal model. They've pushed the neoliberal model on us. But if you look at what they're doing something completely different. They're running their economies in a very different way. You look back in the Industrial Revolution period, particularly Britain and Germany, where the Industrial Revolution took off. The state had a very central role to play in that Industrial Revolution process. The use of subsidies, the use of customs duties, tariffs, the use of, government coming in to facilitate research and development, all of these things were very regular, and that is how they developed. There's a Nobel laureate 2001, Joseph Stiglitz, and he was the chief economist of the World Bank, from 1998 to 2001. And he has a great book, it's called Globalization and Its Discontents. And in that book, he talks about how, he says, don't do what they're telling you to do. Do what they did, When they were in their takeoff stages, what did they do? So they'll tell you to pursue privatization, get rid of the government, promote the private sector, and so on and so forth. But really what that only achieves, and what that has achieved in our case, is that it's replaced one set of ruling elites with another set of ruling elites, the private ruling elite, right? So I think it's important to not get bogged down with ideological debates here. I have an ideology. I'm going to be very upfront about that. I am very left-leaning. For those of you who are familiar with me, they know this. I'm going to be upfront about it. But if we're going to have a debate, it's important to look into the details, into the data, into what the numbers are saying, and to take them seriously, right? So I appreciate that question. Very good question. The next sort of part of this discussion is going to be on neoliberalism. Now, I'm going to go through some further statistics here just to sort of answer your question even further, right? So our first structural adjustment program came in the 1980s, in the early stages under the Zia-ul-Haq regime, right? And this was when we sort of privatized, various state enterprises. We promoted the free market system. We got rid of things like, land reform, even as a possibility, because with the Zia-ul-Haq regime, they sort of linked it to religious values, religious ideals. The sanctity of private property is now of religious significance. So you can't really talk about these things at a policy level anymore. They're all of a sudden a controversial, hot topic that is linked to religion, and you can get lynched because of it. Bring up the conversation about land reform now. All of a sudden you're seeing कि यार ये तो धैर्य है. What is he talking about, right? But you see it across the world. It happens everywhere. Now, if you look at how most of the landlords in Pakistan actually acquired their land, this was, they were part of the ruling elites during the British, during the colonizing period, and they were involved in World War II, in exchange for which they received land allotments from the colonizers, right? What they did afterwards was they just passed it on to their generations. So the stat is something like 5% 5% of landlords in Pakistan own 65% of the land. This is the agricultural land. And it's just lying dormant. It's not being used in any kind of productive way. It's just kind of, it's just there. Why is this? Because we haven't even taxed land. We haven't even pursued agricultural tax at all in any capacity, right? So generally when the IMF comes in and they come up with their structural adjustment programs and so on, they have 3 primary objectives, right? We've had 23 programs, 24 programs, and this is a common sort of thread across them. The first is reduction of the fiscal deficit. The second is reduction of the current account deficit, and the third is to control the rate of inflation, right? But if I were to read some numbers out to you, the first structural adjustment program came in sort of like I said, early 80s, right? So the IMF claimed that by 1991, the fiscal account deficit would be reduced to 4.8% of the GDP. But if you look at the numbers, the fiscal deficit actually rose from 7.17% of GDP to 9.5% in 1992 at the end of the program. So not only did it fail to go down, it actually went up, almost doubled. But the IMF did not take any accountability for this. We're like, oh, sorry about that, Export growth, right? The annual average export growth in the 90s after structural adjustment programs was about 5.6%. In the previous decade, before structural adjustment programs, it was actually 9.7%. So exports went down as well, right? The Asian Development Bank, and this is not like a red organization, by the way, this is the Asian Development Bank. This is their study in 1998. They conducted a comprehensive study of, state enterprises that were privatized, 38 in total. They found that 9 of them were found to perform better in terms of efficiency following privatization, while 16 of them actually performed worse following privatization. And the rest of them were just kind of at the same level, right? And so even with privatization, these are just numbers that I'm reading out, okay? Another sort of impact of neoliberal sort of IMF programs was our energy sector. The energy policy of 1994, what were its salient points? This is very important because we lose almost 4 to 5% of our annual GDP because of our energy crisis today, largely as a result of the energy policy in 1994. The energy policy in 1994 said that international power producers are going to come in, they're going to set up shop, and they're going to produce electricity for you. And the government of Pakistan is going to take care of their costs of setting up, of their operations, of their logistics. Not just that, but also pay them a guaranteed rate of return of 15 to 18%. So their profits are also guaranteed. They have no incentive to perform or increase their efficiency or anything of that sort, right? There's a great quote from one of the congresswomen in the US at that time, where she was all praised for this. She was like, oh my God, this is the best energy policy ever seen in history, right? But we see the results of it today. We see the results of it, now. And one of the sort of stipulations of that energy policy was that it would remain in place for 30 years. 30 years, one policy, So is this democratic at all? The IMF, torchbearer of Western ideals, values of freedom, liberty, dignity for the human being. 30 years locked in to that energy policy. Catastrophic results, right? We also privatized our financial sector, right? What is the purpose of a financial sector? What do banks do? What are they supposed to be doing? Anyone? Any ideas? Sure.
The purpose of banks is to, like, people make accounts and they keep their savings and whatever of value in those accounts.
Yeah.
And they're also used for trading. I mean, like,
From a broader economic point of view.
yes, it's like transactions and all that.
Okay, good point. Yeah. So the purpose of banks is to sort of, increase access to formal, bank accounts and, move into a direction where ease of transactions are possible, which eventually leads to economic growth, development, and so on, right? Now, in the financial sector's privatization, again, colossal failure across the board. Today, the 5 largest banks in the private sector own 60% of the deposits and 80% of the profits, right? This is a completely kind of like, almost like a, oligopoly sort of system in the financial sector of Pakistan. There's no competition, Where's the competition? I don't see it, HBL controls everything, mostly, right? Another consequence of privatizing the financial sector was that because they're sort of bottom line, it's all about the bottom line, it's all about profits and so on, they moved away from risky kind of investments, and they moved towards government bonds, which have guaranteed sort of, returns and so on. So government bonds don't really promote any kind of entrepreneurship, any kind of, and this is the sort of mainstream perspective, Government bonds will just be lying there. It's just for the purpose of the government to access funds for the short run, right? So private banks moved in that direction, where they stopped lending to the small and medium enterprises. They stopped lending to, vulnerable communities, young entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth, because those are risky investments. They moved towards government bonds. And this, obviously moved us away from investment at a sort of aggregate level, right? Then we have the telecommunications sector is another great example. The BTCL's privatization took place in 2006, but since then it has led to the laying off about 30,000 workers, 30,000, and its market value is actually plummeted by 75%. Big number, right? It's resulted in a loss of about $3 billion since then. The funny thing is that PTCL was actually profit-making before privatization, right? So, I don't see the results here addressing you, right? And so, so this is the consequences of neoliberal-led sort of, policies in Pakistan. But why do they fail, right? What is the fundamental reason why they fail? Again, like I mentioned at the start of the discussion, there's a great scholar by the name of William Easterly, right, who was also affiliated with the World Bank for a while. And he said that, international financial institutions will sort of have like 3 general sort of perspectives, approaches, where they will adopt an ahistorical approach that will see regions as blank slates to impose theories upon. Number 2, they will prioritize abstract objectives like regional integration and sustainable development goals over, the rights of individuals, right? So you can't really have any accountability if objectives are so abstract. What does regional integration mean, right? Does anyone know what regional integration means? Right. And the third one is like conscious design over spontaneous solutions. So again, it's like a textbook kind of approach. Oh, this is what the economics textbook says, so this is what we're going to do. Instead of responding to, things that come up in real time. Every context is different. Every country has its own, history, their religions, their values, their languages, and so on and so forth. If you're just going to treat every country as the same, and just have this kind of like all-seeing, all-knowing, domineering kind of theory that prevails everywhere, naturally is going to fail, And it has failed across the globe, right? I want to talk a little bit about the impact of neoliberalism on the economics discipline. This is worth understanding because within economics, the neoclassical tradition reigns supreme today. One of the reasons why the IMF was established in the first place, this was in the Bretton Woods Conference right after World War II. It was established to sort of funnel in resources to countries that are struggling economically, and to sort of help them out through short-term, small loans so that they can stabilize and so on. It was very much based on a Keynesian economics model, where the government had a central role in both monetary and fiscal policy. But after the neoliberal turn, what happened was that was all sort of pushed aside in favor of, the sort of free market system, right? And the Washington Consensus played a big role in this, right? And so, again, you have neoclassical economic theory reigning supreme. There used to be various schools of thought within the discipline of economics. You had the Keynesian model, you had the feminist economics model, the ecological economics model, you had the Marxian economics model, the Schumpeterian one, the institutional one, and so on and so forth. But now, it's all neoclassical economics. And if you even deviate slightly from this theory, then you won't be able to publish in big sort of journals across the world anymore, because you're seen as a kind of deviant figure. Right? You're challenging the sort of, established sort of power within the sort of economics discipline, right? And so this kind of system of gatekeeping, where you even sort of deviate slightly and you're sidelined immediately. You can't publish, you can't move forward in your career, because you're just kind of, you don't want to, bow your head to economic theory. It's worth understanding where neoclassical economics originates. So economics in 1945 or so, 1950, you had a man by the name of Friedrich von Hayek, right, who wrote a great paper. I'm a big fan of Hayek, by the way. Important thinker that I think everybody should read. But he is the sort of intellectual founding father of neoliberalism. He wrote a paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he argued that the nature of knowledge is such that it is diffuse, it is very context-specific, and it is largely unarticulated. Does everyone know what those things mean? Diffuse means that it's like spread across society, right? Everybody has like bits of the puzzle, right? Context-specific means that whatever sort of life that I'm leading, my relationships, the institutions I'm affiliated with, my family, cultural background, those are the kinds of information tidbits that I'll have in my head, right? And largely unarticulate obviously means that whatever knowledge that I have in my mind, I'm not really going to talk about it all the time. They're just in my head, right? In my mind. And he said, therefore, government intervention of any sort is always bound to fail, because the government never has perfect information, and so on and so forth. And so he said that, in the interest of freedom for everybody, should have the government just completely sidelined. The government should act as a sort of entity that ensures security for private property, and that is really the end of it, right? That's the role of the government, is what Hayek was talking about. And the funny thing is that he's largely correct, right? When he talks about the use of knowledge, he's true. Things he's saying are true at the time of his writing. But since then, especially after the internet came around, the internet sort of revolutionized the production and dissemination of knowledge across the world. We didn't have that in 1945 or 50 and so on. And so it's worth paying attention to that as well and taking that seriously, right? The sort of theories that Hayek was talking about are outdated now. They don't really, hold true in the final analysis. With the internet, everybody has access to all kinds of information through things like social media, through articles on the internet. You can download whatever books you want to download. It's all free, and so on and so forth. So the nature of knowledge has radically shifted since the time of Hayek's writing, right? The way neoclassical economics describes rationality, their fundamental unit of analysis is the rational individual, right? But rationality is defined in a sort of, certain kind of a way. It's defined as instrumental rationality, where you have a set of sort of like, objectives, and you're just like mindlessly kind of pursuing them to, achieve some sort of like, outcome at the end of it. Max Weber is one of the founding fathers of sociology as a discipline. He talked about 4 different kinds of rationality. You had tradition, you had emotion, you had things like, what's it called? Like when you have like a situation where it's not exactly that you have a goal in mind, but you're almost behaving in an unconscious kind of a way because those are the things that you've always known. That is another kind of rationality. It's not really to be discounted, right? But economic theory, neoclassical economic theory, will just pursue that one sort of line. It's all instrumental rationality. You have a set of objectives, achieving those. You're a selfish, self-interested kind of individual. You're not really concerned about what other people are doing. You just have your own sort of thoughts in mind and so on, your own objectives. Neoclassical economics also talks a lot about notions of freedom, right? But again, over here, the way they define freedom is the absence of constraints to action, right? In other words, it's like if you don't have any sort of external forces preventing you from doing what you want to do, then you are technically free as far as economic theory is concerned, right? But there's this great scholar by the name of Isaiah Berlin who wrote this book called Two Concepts of Liberty. He talked about the other side, positive freedom. So what I just described is negative freedom. The other part of this is positive freedom, where you incubate the sort of conditions that allow people to take autonomous action in the first place. If I'm living my day-to-day life worrying about how I'm going to put food on the table for my family, I'm not really free. I might not have any sort of constraints and so on, but I'm not really free to make my own decisions in an autonomous way, right? So again, it's like this clever sleight of hand where they just highlight one side of the equation with freedom. They don't talk about the other side, right? And so a lot of this has to do also with a kind of professionalization of development, right? Development once used to mean just sort of system of negotiation between the various stakeholders in society, particularly on notions of power, right? Labor had its interests, feminists will have their interests, ecologists will have their interests, students will have their interests, and so on and so forth, right? And development is a process of negotiation between all of these sort of forces in society. But with neoclassical economics, it's now professionalized. You have to have a degree from Ivy League or some other like big university where you are brainwashed with neoclassical theory to be able to be qualified to talk about economics now. So this kind of like move away, like completely sidelining ordinary people from the process. Policy is now something that will take place from ivory towers behind closed doors where most people don't even know what is being talked about or what kind of policies are being passed, allegedly in their favors, right? And so development now is like, you have things like the NGO sector, you have things like the therapy sector and so on and so forth. It's all very much like, it's project cleanup for capitalism, right? It's almost like if somebody was unable to go to school, because their parents couldn't afford it, and they're feeling left out, left behind because of that, and they go and seek therapy. And this is a kind of societal, economic kind of problem, right? But what the therapist will tell them is that no, there's something wrong with your interpretation, and there's something wrong with how you're coping with this situation. They will individualize societal level problems. I appreciate that. We can talk about it. Oh, I appreciate that. We can have an exchange. Yeah, for sure. What are your thoughts about this?
We do study economy. So if a client is coming in a session and he's like having some of these thoughts and problems, we give them solutions as well, like how you can go and find solution to just earn some money and go and you can still study. Like you can start from zero. There's no age to just like if you want to go and sit in class 1, like go ahead. You can just go and if you're 18, just go and sit at class 1 and just start from zero. No, that's not something like what you said, there's something wrong with your...
I appreciate that.
That was offensive, like, no.
Okay. I appreciate that. But like, let's say like, they want to go to school, but their parents can't afford to send them to school. And they're not going to go to school. And like you said, you can still go and earn money and so on. But what if they go and apply to a corporation or whatever, and their corporation asks them, where did you go to school? Right? They really don't have much to say in that situation. They're almost sidelined. I'm not trying to discount the problem of mental health. Mental health is very real. I'm just trying to say that it's a symptom, of a perverse and system that has broken down, rates of, access, like people accessing or seeking out therapy have only gone up over time. What I'm trying to say is that we should look at this from a broader point of view and ask the question of why that is happening, right? It's not a coincidence that people are just getting mentally ill now with depression and anxiety and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that clearly there are certain rifts and breakages within the system, which means that most people are unable to sort of keep up in this kind of rat race that's presented to them, right? But when you go and seek a therapist, they'll say, okay, here's this pill, take this pill, you'll feel better, come back.
Therapists don't suggest.
They'll send them to the psychiatrist.
Those are what psychiatrists do. We don't do that.
I appreciate that, but they do sort of send you to the psychiatrist, right, in a lot of cases. And the psychiatrist... I appreciate the emotions, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, for sure. Just a second. So just to finish this point, take this pill, come back to me 2 weeks down the road, I'll give you more pills, you'll feel better. But the kind of way these pills are designed is that they'll make you more and more dependent, right? This has actually happened with my younger sister even, so this is it hits very close to home. And I have emotions myself, right? And so if you're stuck in that cycle, when I asked my sister about this, now,
I think she should change her psychiatrist.
no, we've tried multiple ones. I'm from Karachi, and so we have a variety of psychologists, therapists. We've tried multiple. What she says now is that it's almost now like a kind of pastime, right? It's almost like I just go and gupshup hoti hai, But the only difference is like I'm taking colorful pills now, right? Just to sort of maintain kind of like sanity and so on, right? So again, I want to emphasize that I'm not trying to discount the very real problem of mental health. I'm just trying to encourage you all to sort of think about what function it serves in society, right? Pharmaceutical industries really benefit from this system. The insurance sector benefits tremendously from this system. Healthcare industry benefits tremendously. When pharmaceuticals engage with the hospitals and so on, they try to sell their medicines to them, prescribe these to your patients and so on, right? I'm just trying to encourage you to think about the sort of economic kind of dynamics at play here, right? And so it's the same with the sort of NGO sector. When things don't work out, when the government is unable to provide education and healthcare for the people, the NGO sector will come in and try to fill that void. We saw this last year with the floods in Pakistan, when large parts of the country were submerged. I believe 33 million displaced from their homes, approximately $40 billion in losses, right? The NGO sector comes in and, they try to play project cleanup in that situation, right? Where is the government? I have a friend, she's a journalist, she went into Rentier to look into the situation over there during the floods. And, there were like helicopters coming in and sort of airdropping supplies to the people like their animals, and a lot of the water that was, given to them, polluted water, muddy water, the food that was given, hardly edible, So if the government is that incompetent, then naturally you're going to have NGOs and so on try to minimize or mitigate the damage of that situation, right? So that is the system now. When you just completely eradicate the government from everywhere, then you have this kind of a situation where you have all these kinds of domains, playing project cleanup all the time. Consultancies are a great example of this as well. What do consultants do, by the way? Anyone? They make presentation slides, I think, right? But that's really all they do. I'm really curious about this. Right. I never understood what consultants do, right? Sure, we can have that. Anyway, so just moving on, right? So I just wanted to go through the sort of concerns about neoliberalism. This is the neoliberal development model, right? But who benefits ultimately from all of these things, right? According to a study from the UNDP, about 2.7 trillion rupees are extracted from the economy of Pakistan on an annual basis. This translates to about $12 to $15 billion every year, extracted through things like favorable taxation, things like price, preferences, ease of access to certain kinds of spaces, and so on and so forth. This will benefit the sort of ruling elites, which are the kind of industrialists of Pakistan, the security apparatus of Pakistan, because trade unions are now eliminated, no politics at work, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You can run your corporation like it's your personal empire almost, right? How are corporations run? Orders are passed down from the top, every subsequent level, and you're expected to follow what everybody's saying. Otherwise, you're shown the door, right? So this is like in practice what sort of the free market model really operates like. You keep your head down and you follow orders. Otherwise, you're free to leave. Free. This is freedom. This is how we're going to define freedom, right? You're free to leave is what they say. You have, a choice here. And so Pakistan's security apparatus has really benefited one of the most from, neoliberal policies. The kind of sort of their corporate empire, Askari Bank, DHA, the Frontier Works Organization, National Logistics Cell, so on and so forth, right? A flourishing kind of business empire where there is no sort of government involvement. With DHA, they can they can grab land whenever they want. There is no even questions that are asked from governments, from the government of Pakistan, I should say. So this works out tremendously well for them. The annual budget, everybody talks about like sort of curtailing defense expenditures in Pakistan, but the annual budget that is assigned to the security apparatus, it's hardly what they, hardly representative of the kind of access they have to funds, because most of their funds are coming from their corporations, from their businesses, right? And so that has functioned to give them a sort of free hand, It has functioned to give them a formal sort of, domineering kind of role in our politics because they always have access to funds, some of which have come through involvement in wars of other countries, imperial powers, some of which have come through their corporate empire, right? And so one of the primary beneficiaries of neoliberalism is the security apparatus, right? I want to read out this final sort of statistic before we move to the last part. The top 5 countries in the world on the Human Development Index in 2020 were Norway, Ireland, Switzerland, Hong Kong, and Iceland. Government expenditure as a percentage of GDP in each of these was 58%, 27%, 38%, 13%, and 51%, which means on average, this amounts to about 38%. The top 5 countries in the world on the Human Development Index, right? This is over 1/3 of the economy, right? And so developed countries such as the UK, US, most of Europe, East Asian tigers, and so on, they all had a heavy government involvement in their sort of economic activities during their takeoff stages. This is a fact. This is all documented. It wasn't just get rid of the government from everywhere, discontinue all sort of initiatives under the government, hand it all to the private sector. There is no example in history where this has worked. None. Zero, right? And so again, important to take all of this very seriously and acknowledge it. Now, just in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the last stage, which is kind of like a way forward. Let's talk about some solutions, and I encourage you to sort of chime in here as well. So what can we do, right, to sort of move beyond and take an exit, from this kind of economic quagmire that we find ourselves in? One of the things very important is land reform. We have never taken this seriously. Taiwan, Japan, China, a lot of the East Asian tigers, they all conducted very comprehensive land reforms during their takeoff stages. Land reform is important for 2 reasons. One is that it boosts agricultural productivity, and the other is that it influences governance arrangements. In the sense when ruling elites today, they want to campaign for elections and so on, they have to go through these big landlords and sort of, exchange favors with them and tell them to sort of, get votes in their sort of respective communities through coercive power. We have to be clear about that. That is the only means through which they sort of extract these votes, right? So if you have land reform, they won't have to necessarily go through these electables anymore, and you'll have a system where merit is actually prioritized over, sort of politics of patronage, right? That's number one. Unionization, trade unions, student unions, farmers associations should all be reinstated, This is very important because otherwise you just have a free hand for the corporate sector. There's a study by PIDE, where I work, on the sort of KSC 100, which is the list of top performing corporations listed on the stock exchange. We looked at their executive boards to see who's populating these executive boards. Each of them, 100 companies. We found that all of them belong to 31 primary families. This is the private sector, efficiency in the private sector. Oh my God, profit motive, this and that, right? But we don't see this. And this is a study that happened in 2020 or 2021 or so. Very recent study, right? So it's not really working out. And why is that? It's because our companies in Pakistan are run as state companies, They're run as personal empires of whoever the owner happens to be, and their sort of personal preferences and their whims and so on and so forth, right? So unionization is something that will improve efficiency, because whoever is occupying the executive boards will then know that labor, which is the primary stakeholder within a corporation or an organization, has a say. They have a sort of like input about how the company should be run and so on and so forth. Right now, it's just, whoever's my friend at the company, I'm just going to give them the biggest favor, not really thinking about merit or anything like that, right? That's number 2. Decentralization of power is the third one, right? Now, we had the 18th Amendment. It was only on paper. We never really pursued local governments. We never empowered them from a financial point of view or an administrative point of view, right? Local governments aren't like, there's no elections that happen for local governments, and even if they do, the mayor, whoever it is, they don't really have any sort of like power in that situation, and ultimately they're sort of, bowing their heads to whoever the provincial government is, right? Now, the NFC award, the National Finance Commission, which grants every year a certain amount of money to provinces, that should be taken and turned into the a sort of a local sort of local level sort of finance commission, where each district gets a certain amount of funds depending on how many people there are in that district, right? And that is what is going to give them the tools to actually pursue the kinds of policies that they'd like. And this is decentralized, so they're actually going to pursue the policies that are relevant for the people and their constituents and so on, right? And that's number 3. Number 4 is the political parties of Pakistan must unify right now against military intervention, right? Non-combat, non-development expenditure should be cut down immediately. The military should not be getting these kinds of funds, and it is in the interest of all political parties in Pakistan right now to pursue that, right? Instead, what they're doing right now is they're still sort of trying to signal their usefulness to the security establishment, right? This is in none of their interests. If they want to pursue a situation where they're actually coming into power for the right reasons, this is something that they all can sort of unify with, right? Next, the regulation of the financial sector. The government should play an active role in ensuring that investments are being made to the SME sector, to young entrepreneurs, to students, and so on and so forth. Move away from this kind of government bond system, right? That's number 4. Number 5. Foreign relations. Foreign relations is generally sort of sidelined in Pakistan. I think foreign relations and diplomacy in general should adopt a different kind of approach. And I think the PPP government has, not the PPP government, but Bilawal and Chair Iman and so on, they've been sort of heading in this direction. But climate and energy are 2 things that our ruling elites should prioritize when it comes to diplomacy in the international sphere. Since 1988, 92% of global emissions have come from the global north. Who is in the global north? North America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Israel, and so on. It's a few countries. 92% of emissions have come from there. They should take accountability for this. The global south does not contribute to climate emissions, right? And so the global south should unify to push for climate reparations, to push for climate justice, to even push for colonial reparations, right? Approximately $45 trillion, estimated by some scholars, were extracted from the subcontinent during colonization. This is money that was stolen, right? We can argue about the number, maybe it was 40, maybe it was 39, or whatever it was, but the point still stands, right? This is money that was taken away. So the global south, and this will also help with, regional integration, This will improve relations with our neighboring countries and so on. We have common objectives, right? Industrial policy should be promoted. Government should play a central role in promoting the industry. Education and healthcare should be promoted, in a genuine kind of way. I don't mean just sort of relegate it and hand it over to consultants who will come in and, do their thing, I mean, actually, government has to be populated by actual experts in the fields and the domains who will actually do a good job with that, right? Next, internet for all. And this is something that PIDE really advocates for as well. I was in Karachi recently, and I took a rickshaw. I didn't have to go too far. And so on the way, the rickshaw driver, he starts to have a conversation with me. He's like, we're talking about inflation. He's talking about how he can't sort of send his kids to school, all this trouble that he's facing. And then he says, "Sir, aapko pata neoliberalism kya hota hai?" And I was like, "What? Really?" And I was like, "No, I don't know. You tell me." And he actually gave me a really good explanation, right? And he told me, he was like, "Are you familiar with Dr. Taimur Rahman?" I was like, "Wow, this is insane, right?" Sure, most of you are familiar with him. And he was like, मैं उनकी videos हमेशा देखता हूँ YouTube पे, उनकी कोई मैं video miss नहीं करता, So the working classes, we sort of perceive the working classes as like dumb people who don't really know what they're doing, right? But the working classes are very actively engaged through social media and through YouTube and other, internet sources. And so internet for all should be a policy, no questions asked. Everybody should have access to the internet. This is very important for peripheral areas like GB and so on as well. Now, arts and culture is, I have arts and culture in here as well. Now, this is something that most people will see it as, this is a peripheral kind of activity, it's not very important. But let me read this statistics to you. Maula Jatt actually grossed over 10 million USD on the box office since release. Joyland almost made it to the Oscars. It was nominated, and it was shortlisted. It didn't win, but regardless. Pasuri currently has over 500 million views on YouTube. Arooj Aftab has won a Grammy, right? And why do we continue to insist on seeing the arts as a peripheral activity that's not very important? This culture should change, because arts and culture is not really for its commercial value, which it is that. The statistics I just read out to you are mostly commercial. But arts and culture improve, enhance the general sort of culture in society. They get people to think about nuanced ideas. They get people to consider the sort of power relations that they're a part of, Most of my own sort of intellectual sort of evolution over the years, I credit to the kinds of films I've seen over the years, the theater performances that I've seen and so on and so forth. Especially in a country like Pakistan where you don't have access to formal education, arts and culture can actually act as a, sort of education means, right? And this is very important. Next, urban transit. We have not really pursued urban transport in Pakistan for our major cities. And this has had tremendous consequences, right? Even from a purely economic, mainstream economics point of view. If people can't travel from one place to the other, they're going to avoid certain jobs, certain employment opportunities, and so on and so forth, right? Just because they can't, travel from their workplaces to their homes and so on. Urban transport should be prioritized. Whoever I want to see when the political parties start campaigning formally, if they have any of these sort of issues that I mentioned today on their campaigns, on their agendas, and so on. I really doubt it, because they're not interested in sort of pursuing inclusive development. But we can hope, I guess. Next is tax reform. We should move away from this culture where the large bulk of our taxes come in the form of indirect sales taxes, which are regressive in their nature. They impact the most vulnerable most of all. We should pursue things like land taxes, wealth taxes, and corporate taxes, and so on, agricultural taxes, right? actually tax the people who are just, really enjoying themselves and not really, doing anything productive in society today. This is a very simple point, but, to this day we don't really see it in Pakistan. Next, I want to address the sort of young people over here, right? I think most of you are sort of on the younger side. There's this great quote from Malcolm X, right? Who's one of my heroes. He said that power is not something that will ever be handed to you. You'll never receive it on a silver platter as a gift from the powers that be, right? You have to take it. You have to snatch it. You have to do what you can to change the situation around you, right? And if we're just going to behave as passive spectators in society, nothing's really going to ever change, because the ruling elites will never have a kind of, consequences for failing to perform. This is the consequences. And when the French Revolution happened, the ruling elites, the people are at their throats. I'm not advocating violence here, but there was a price to pay for not performing, right? And so I think the youth of Pakistan, which is over 50% of people in Pakistan are below the age of 23. That's the stat. They should really take a stand, adopt a disciplined kind of lifestyle where they take things seriously, read a lot, improve the sort of knowledge base that you have in your mind. That is how you're going to understand your place in the world, your place in the international division of labor, and so on and so forth. And it's important to engage with thinkers that you don't necessarily agree with, because otherwise you're like a sort of domesticated cat, right? You've just been taught everything. You're brainwashed almost, right? Some of my favorite thinkers are actually conservatives, the likes of Roger Scruton, the likes of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, Neil Ferguson in the UK. Some of my favorite thinkers are libertarian thinkers, Robert Nozick, Friedrich Hayek we talked about, Ayn Rand, for instance. You might think I have a sense of animosity towards these people, but it's important to engage with what they said so that you can actually, place it within a sort of larger framework. Hegel, the philosopher, talked about the dialectical process, where you have a synthesis, you have an antithesis, and then you have a synthesis, which becomes a thesis again, and so on. And that is how history moves forward, right? It's when two schools of thought will bump heads with each other, and the better one will emerge victorious, and so on and so forth. But if you're only familiar with one side of the equation, there's this great quote from John Stuart Mill, from his little tract on liberty, where he said, "Those who only know their side know little of that," right? It's only when you juxtapose it with its opposition point of views that you can actually learn something and actually create some sort of difference, right? And so, rise ye children, and so on. And with that, I'd like to end this conversation. It's 8:30. I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you all tuning in. And we can have a round of questions just sort of before we end.
Hi.
Yeah.
The lecture was very good. Thank you for that.
Of course.
I would like to raise one issue.
Yeah.
जो कि हम अक्सर देखते हैं कि न्यूलिबरलिज्म में एक comment उनकी तरफ से आता है, और वो ये होता है कि the free market provides at least the freedom to everyone who thinks he has the ability or capability to climb that ladder. वो opportunity देते हैं. But on the other hand, when state control things, तो it has a monopoly over things. And people who are capable or who have ideas, they do not get the chance to come forward. जिस तरह हम communism में देखते हैं कि state has everything. Even अगर हम communist China में देखें तो you only can be in politics अगर आप जो main उनकी जो party या political party अगर आप उसको join करते हैं. So there is no dissenting opinion.
Right.
Although I do stand on the side of communism more than this neoliberalism or capitalism, but I would really like you to give me a dissenting opinion on this. Okay, if someone gives me that argument, so how should I dissent it? Okay, जब वो मुझे कहते हैं कि neoliberalism gives the platform or the freedom, so give me a dissenting opinion on that.
Sure. Thank you for that. Okay, we can have a couple of questions and then I'll address each of them. Thanks for that question. Good question. G, please.
It was a very good lecture you have given, and your solutions aren't, what you have proposed aren't bad. But I have certain questions regarding some of your proposals.
Please,
like when you
please.
talk about land reforms,
Yeah.
how are we supposed to do land reforms which does not kind of upset or at least offend the big landlords out there? And when we talk about this establishing unions, then how are we supposed to do that without otherwise offending the higher ups?
Okay.
And you get like etc.
I understand. Sure.
Okay, my question is that you said about neoliberalism and that's how it occurs for the nation right now, and how the international institution have proved curse for Pakistan throughout the history. But if you look, we have the problem that we are cursing and blaming the international institution for what we had done. We are performing bad. Actually, our elite class has been performing bad, due to which we cannot blame the international institution. We have the habit of blaming the international institution. The international institution, what they're going to tell you, they're going to give you structural reforms, how you can need to reduce your fiscal deficit, you need to increase your like revenues, and that's we should do. Okay, but what we have the problem in Pakistan right now, we are actually all the consumer. I want to say we are not the producer. If you look at it, all the developed nation, they are not only consumer humans, they are producer. We are actually less than animal as well. I'm not feeling bad because we only consume, we not produce, because the animal can produce something, but we are the Pakistani right now. Look at it, our export, it's even less than the sub-Saharan African countries.
Yeah.
So that is the curse. We have the habit of blaming the international institution, what we are performing. Why we are not blaming our elite class right now for what we have done wrong with our country, this class, but we are always blaming these all international institutions.
Sure. Okay. So I'm going to address those three, and then we'll have one more round of skibat. Okay? So the first question from here, where you talked about capitalism offering opportunities to people, at least if nothing else, it offers opportunities, right? Now this goes back to what we talked about earlier about two notions of freedom. It talks about like the absence of constraints to action, right? But again, like let's take a very sort of example close to home. If I have been living my entire life in a rural community of Balochistan, poor, no access to healthcare, education, nothing of the sort, right? Within the mode of capitalism, that is perfectly okay, because I might be born into poverty, but there's nobody stopping me from becoming Elon Musk, technically, right? Right. Exactly, right? It's I have the freedom to do that, and so on, and good luck to me, right? That's what generally. So the situation that you described, I think you're describing capitalism, right? If you look at like levels of inequality, there's a great report by the Oxfam from a few years ago where they talk about how the top 10 richest people in the world own about like 50% of the resources or something like that, right? Is this opportunity, right? Or is this a kind of like another fancy feudal structure, right? If it was really about opportunity, then you'd have much more sort of an equitable sort of distribution because of legitimate sort of competition between people, prevailing. Again, true freedom. Amartya Sen is another Nobel laureate who talked a little bit about this in his thesis on development as freedom, right? Where he talked about you have to ensure 5 kinds of freedom, which involve political freedom, economic freedom, access to social protection, transparency guarantees. This would be in like the media, information landscape, and so on. There are like 5 kinds of freedom, and he said that if you at any stage have the absence of even one of them, you can't really talk about freedom in that situation, right? It's only when you guarantee each of them that you can even begin to think about freedom, right? Again, if I'm just worrying about, if I'm presented with the choice of either going to the hospital to, get some treatment for my diabetes or send my children to school, if those are the kinds of options that are presented to me, I'm not really going to be thinking about how to self-actualize and create an impact in the world and, come up with some sort of innovation that's going to resolve climate change. I'm just thinking about how do I survive? How do I help my family survive, right? And that is the system of capitalism, right? Fundamentally. I don't mean this in a kind of like ideological way. I mean that very sort of in a scientific way. Very, this is all very much documented. I'd encourage you to read Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, where he talks about rising levels of inequality, incentive structures, and how the system is designed fundamentally to promote those things. They're not bugs in the system, they are features of the system, right? So I hope I've addressed your question. The second one was on land reform. How are we going to do land reform? How are we going to promote trade unions and so on without upsetting those in power, right? We should upset them, They have been upsetting everybody else for a very long time. I don't think we should be concerned about upsetting them. Mao Zedong, who led the Cultural Revolution in China, he was primarily responsible for the land reforms in China, right? This is a bit of an extreme example, but I'll just mention it. Because without Mao's contribution, China would be nowhere near as successful as they are today, right? When he was sort of like organizing with the peasantry, he lived there for years, mobilizing them, educating them, and so on. And that's how the sort of movement began, where land was taken away from the feudals at that time and so on. Mao is very famous for saying this to his workers at that time. He said, whoever of you goes personally and takes over the land of these sort of feudals who have been destroying our nation for the past 300, 400, 500 years will be among my close circle, right? And he was very clear about this. Naturally, it led to a lot of violence. People died, a lot of murder and bloodshed, right? And that's not something we should aspire to. I'm trying to get the impression, the idea across that if you really want to take a departure from the way things have been, you will have to upset certain people. And I think that's okay, right? So, third, last question. Blaming international financial institutions for our troubles, right? I think you're right. I think, the buck always ends with those who actually have power in society. And those are our ruling elites. The security establishment, the industrialists, the landlords, the corporate heads of big corporations, and so on and so forth. These are all part of the ruling elite in Pakistan, and they should be blamed. They should be blamed. But I think, having said that, it's important to not hate the player, but hate the game, right? You have to look at the system within which they're operating, because each of these actors is responding to certain incentives that are presented to them. If I'm running a big sort of industry, I will naturally try to curry favors with the government to get subsidies. I'll behave in a sort of rent-seeking kind of a way because it's just easy for me. And I'll tell them, okay, if you do me this favor, I'll help you out with the next election. I'll donate some to your campaign and so on and so forth, right? So you're right that they should be blamed, but I think the system should be blamed even more. Financial institutions cannot be given a free pass though, right? The way financial institutions work, we can't be naive about this, right? The IMF, as just an example, the IMF constitutes shareholding from each country around the world. The United States has the biggest shareholding in the IMF. All of the prescriptions that will come from the IMF are in line with the geopolitical interests of the United States. The IMF recently approved a $15 billion loan to the Ukraine in their conflict with Russia and so on. There is no economic justification for this. There can never be. It's a purely political thing, right? The IMF is not a neutral organization. They have their interests, so they can be given a free hand. But you're right, ruling elites in Pakistan should be blamed. Okay.
Abbas, thank you for the engaging talk. दो या तीन मुख्तसर comments के साथ कुछ queries, questions पूछने की कोशिश करूँगा.
Just wrap up quickly.
जिस तरह neoliberalism के बहुत ज़्यादा issues है, we know it. But क्या इनके जब issues को हम गिनते हुए कोई दूसरा जो opposite side लेते हैं उसकी मदद सराही में हम कुछ आगे चले जाते हैं, we compare पाकिस्तान, क्योंकि आपने स्टार्ट किया हिस्टोरिकल जिस तरीके से पाकिस्तान में गवर्नमेंट्स ने क्या किया, एंड देन यू काउंटेड द सक्सेस स्टोरीज ऑफ सिंगापुर एंड कंट्रीज ऑफ द काइंड, ठीक है. डोंट यू थिंक कि हम यहाँ पे लेमन्स और एप्पल्स को कंपेयर करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, क्योंकि आपके पाकिस्तान में ग्राउंड रियलिटीज़ है,
ऑफ कोर्स
दैट्स लाइक बहुत ही डिफरेंट रहा है. क्योंकि अगर आप जेम्स बुशनन को अगर आपने पढ़ा होगा तो उसमें पब्लिक चॉइस थ्योरी की बात करते हैं, तो गवर्नमेंट में बैठे हुए लोगों के पब्लिक गुड्स या पब्लिक बेनिफिट का कितना ख्याल होता है, यू नो इट वेल. तो उनके अपने पर्सनल सेल्फ इंटरेस्ट होते हैं.
गुड पॉइंट.
उसके बावजूद भी इफ़ यू थिंक कि यू नो लाइक दिस कैन बी डन, तो वो मीर ने कहा था ना कि मीर क्या सादा है, बीमार हुए जिसके सबब उसी तार के लटके से दवा लेते हैं, राइट. सो मेरे ख्याल में हम कुछ ज़्यादा ही ऑप्टिमिस्टिक होते हैं.
Of course.
और एंड देन अगेन यू शेयर द फिगर्स लाइक जिस तरह गवर्नमेंट एक्सपेंडिचर टू जीडीपी. एक्सपेंडिचर ठीक है, स्पेंडिंग तो हो रही है, मतलब स्पेंडिंग से निकलता क्या है? डू यू काउंट दोज नंबर एज वेल?
ऑफ कोर्स.
क्या मतलब सिर्फ गवर्नमेंट ने स्पेंड किया बट उससे प्रोडक्ट क्या आया, ग्रोथ क्या हुई?
Sure.
डू यू आल्सो यू नो डीम दोज नंबर्स और नॉट? एंड थर्ड, in the context of you know like AI की बात करें आजकल के दिनों में, how do you think regulations by the government and all can be done, और कैसे हो सकता है ये सब कुछ? Thank you.
ठीक है, okay. Just one more, and then I'll be outside. You know, we can have a cigarette together. Right.
This is Mohammed Chanzeb, a student of political science.
Yeah.
I will be very brief in my question. What specific measures we need to take to reform this rentier economy of Pakistan?
Okay, I thought I went through quite a few, but yeah, okay. Acha, so just like addressing Naveed's questions, so I agree that there should be context-specific policies. The reason I mentioned the examples of all these other countries is to just challenge this idea that the private sector is the only way to sort of, you know, pursue inclusive, sustainable development. You know, across the world, you know, the UK is a great example, Scandinavia is a great example, Europe and so on. All of their sort of healthcare, education, housing, and so on are largely state-controlled, and they're working very well. And that's the only sort of point I want to demonstrate. I'm not making a value judgment that one is necessarily better than the other. I'm just trying to say that we should approach these things with more sort of complexity and acknowledge the sort of success stories, especially China, for instance, who got rid of like 40% of their, you know, extreme poverty in a few years and so on. Right? And the next was on government expenditure as a percent of GDP, right? Naturally, when I quote the OECD countries, right, these are the best performing countries across the world, right? The developed world, right? The government expenditure as a percent of GDP has only gone up in all of these countries since the fall of the Soviet Union, right? So naturally, it can't just be like a wastage expenditure going on. Naturally. And, you know, I want to just like, if you want to go into the sort of intellectual background of this, Max Weber talked about how, you know, heavy, you know, bureaucracies they're not a bug in the system of capitalism. You know, they're a very central feature of capitalism. You need to have them in order to preserve the system. And, you know, I'll share some readings with you on this, just in the interest of time, need to wrap up. AI technologies, can you just like, repeat your question on that?
Like regulation and all, how is this possible?
On AI technologies? Right. Now, this is like an emerging debate across the world. I feel like the cat is out of the bag with AI, you know. So I think any sort of attempts to regulate it or try to control it and so on, it's not really going to work out that well. Even if you look at things like ChatGPT, for instance, in its sort of initial iterations, it was sort of giving people responses that might be considered quite controversial and so on. And Google responded to that by sort of regulating it, and it has sort of changed its general sort of orientation since then. So there is some sort of possibility here, but I think over the long haul, the approach with AI should be to harness it, you know. Bertrand Russell is a great philosopher who was writing in the 1940s. He wrote this great essay called In Praise of Idleness, right? And this was before a lot of sort of, you know, capitalist development and so on. He said that, you know, we have arrived at a situation in the world today where we have enough resources, you know, to end global poverty several times over. I think the number was 60 or so, right? And he asked the question, you know, why do we have this almost religious obsession with work? Why do we have to always necessarily be doing something or the other, regardless of how productive it is, regardless of what sort of use value it's serving in society. David Graeber, anthropologist, wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs, where he went and he asked like thousands of people about their work, and he asked them simple questions like, do you think your work serves any function? What do you think would happen if your job was hypothetically eliminated? Across the board, most people said that not only would it not really impact anything in an adverse way, if my job was eliminated, it would be a net positive for the world. Most people responded with that, which means that most people are doing nonsense work, right? And I think AI will only sort of improve or enhance that sort of process. When more work becomes easier, everything becomes automated and so on. I think we should try to think about how to harness AI technology to serve, human needs and requirements and so on. I don't think we should fear it. I don't think we should be Luddites about this situation. I think it can be a very powerful tool to improve the world. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate you. Thank you.